Dale Morris was named Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Charleston last summer. He tells me what projects he's working on, including the proposed seawall, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook.
Dale Morris, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you.
I know that obviously you're the former director of the Strategic Partnerships with the Water Institute, and just recently you were named the City of Charleston's Chief Resilience Officer.
Mm-hmm.
What's new, what's now with your position?
What's new is I'm learning my ways around Charleston. It's a wonderful city. I worked here before, but now I'm a resident, and what a wonderful place to be. Charleston is like an onion. I'm peeling back the various layers, and there's a whole lot, many more layers to go, but it is just a spectacular place with a wonderful history and a wonderful future.
What are the layers when it comes to resilience?
So in the jargon in the professional jargon, the layers are physical system resilience, so infrastructure, and so green and gray infrastructure, community resilience, and economic resilience, and they all have components to it. So those are things we're working on here in the city. Of course, my primary job right now is focused on flood resilience, because it is a very high risk, very high hazard for the city, and it's one of the reasons why I came here to do this. So again, water resilience and flood resilience are very important to my job on a day-to-day basis, very important to the mayor and the rest of the citizens in the city. But we're looking at heat resilience too in the future, because folks in the South think, well, it's hot, it doesn't matter, but heat carries with it a tremendous amount of risk, hazard, and it isn't something that we should ignore going forward.
I want to talk to you more about that in a minute, but let me talk to you about the obvious, the seawall.
Yeah, the seawall.
The 8-mile, 12.8 kilometer project would include a wall rising of 8 feet, 2.5 meters above tide flood levels. What are those tidal flood levels right now, Charleston?
So Charleston measures its water levels from mean low water. There's a tide gauge over on the Cooper River, right near the High Battery. And the water is measured from mean low water. The surge structure, keep this in mind, is measured from NAVD88, and there's a little more than 3 feet difference between those two. So when we say there's a minor flood at Broad and Lockwood, that is 7-foot mean low water, right? But it is about 4-foot NAVD88. So these are tricky things that the public doesn't need to understand, but are things that we need to work with. So if you're thinking about a surge wall around the peninsula of Charleston, you have to think of the relative land level and then how much needs to come above that to get to NAVD 88.
And what is that land level right now?
Again, at Broad and Lockwood, it's about 4-foot NAVD 88, or 7-foot mean low water. Okay, so there's different water levels. The water touches the land, so a lot of people are looking at land level versus the water. So there we think of a water level. But if you're looking at, let's say, Brittlebank Park, if you're at the margin of Brittlebank Park right next to Lockwood, you are probably at about 8-foot NAVD 88. But if you're next to the river, you're probably at 5-foot NAVD 88. So it just depends on where you are. And let's keep in mind the top of the surge structure would be 12-foot NAVD 88. So not 12 foot above land level, but 12 foot above, not 12 foot above water level, but 12 foot above relative land level.
Wow. And I know the plan includes dozens of gates that will close and block off roads, streams, and walkways when a storm approaches, pumps will push out water when the gate closes. Mm-hmm. Does the City of Charleston have a serious analysis as to whether or not this is the best place to start?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. The best place to start. The Army Corps of Engineers, at the city's request, Congress funded 100% the feasibility study to see if the Charleston Peninsula would benefit from such a structure. The Army Corps of Engineers can work anywhere, but the city requested them to come here and look. Through this process, the feasibility process, which started in 2018, the Army Corps determined, yes, there's a hazard, there's serious surge risk. Yes, that risk is sufficiently high that the federal government would benefit from spending money in advance to prevent the damage, as opposed to responding afterwards to the damage, right? Prevention is almost always cheaper than reaction. So should the federal government spend money here? And that's the feasibility analysis. And the feasibility analysis also looking at, is it technically feasible? Is there space to build it? Is there a way to build it? Can you construct it on the ground that's here? And then can it be built in a cost-effective way? Those are all the things we're looking at in the feasibility analysis. So yes, we've determined right now that it is feasible. It is financially responsible to do so from a risk mitigation perspective. And yes, there is space to do it. The question we have now going forward is, where do we put it exactly? We have a line on a map, but that line on the map is just a feasibility analysis line. Where do we put it? The Army Corps started by placing the line on public property. The reason for that is quite simple. We don't want to have to take anyone's private property to do this. So we keep it on public property, which is why it is now on a road. The challenge here is it on the left side of the road or the right side of the road? What does it look like? Where are the gates? Those are things we will do in the next phase of the project if we get that far. And so the gates, let me be clear, there are 85 gates that have been suggested as needed for this third structure. The Army Corps of Engineers in their feasibility analysis just said, okay, anywhere this structure would cross a road or would cross a sidewalk or would cross a railroad crossing or is going across the marsh and there's a creek outlet, we need to put a gate there. The question is, when we get into the design phase, can we condense the number of gates to have fewer gates so it's less costly to maintain and operate, and there's less hazard or less risk, because every gate is a potential failure mechanism in the third structure, because if a hurricane is coming 96, 72 hours in advance, the city would be responsible after the thing was constructed to close the gates so the water doesn't get in. But let's just say you forget to close one of the gates. Well, that's a risk factor. So the fewer the gates, the better it is. But at the same time, you have to have sufficient number of gates so that people and cars, you can navigate either side of it when that's possible. So these are things we do in the design phase. We haven't designed anything yet.
Yes, sir. And how many of those gates would you try to condense?
We don't know yet. We just have to see. There are, I think, if you looked at the alignment, there are probably in the French Quarter 20 gates, 20 or 25 gates. Well, is that necessary? We have a question about that, right? If the structure is right on the land water edge, there's no gate needed. But if it's running down Concord Street, how do we navigate that? How do we improve that? In fact, can we use panels as opposed to gates? There are different types of gates. There are lift gates, there are swing gates, there are drop gates. There are all different kinds of gates. Those are things we would try to design in a sensitive way to how the pedestrians, the tourists, the community would use it.
And how many of those panels would you use if you want to condense those?
Well, it just depends on if that's a design question. You would have pilings with supports and you're popping up out of the road, and then you would understand how much forcing is going to have to be on those panels, and that would determine how wide those pilings are. And then you'd have to determine how thick the panels are, and then you have to figure out how quickly you could get those panels to that place and then put them in place. So these are design questions, and there are many options here. They're used around the world. It's just how would we adopt them in the design phase to particular parts of Charleston. So it's just a matter of design here, not really. Again, it's not going to be a gray wall in a lot of places. It'll be something different than that, but we have to design it.
Yes, sir. And what synthetic storms and hydrologic models are you looking at right now?
So the Army Corps of Engineers, through their processes, through this feasibility analysis, they have to run a model to see still water elevation, or just mean surface water elevation with no wind on it. Right. What is the natural condition right now? What is it going to be in 50 years? After this thing is constructed, because they have to understand what the useful life is. And they have to understand, okay, what happens with winds over that period. And so they've taken a number of storms, historic storms, and they've thrown them in the model of where the wind, how the storm tracked, how fast it moved, where it slowed down, how much wind it had, where the wind was coming from. And then they've put a number of synthetic storms on top of that. And this is modeling science. You can do this to fill out a basket, like, okay, this is a good representation of the possible types of storms that would come here. And then they ran a number of scenarios against that model library to see, okay, what is optimal? What is the best type of structure for the peninsula? And then what reduces the most amount of risk for the least amount of cost? So that is the benefit-cost ratio. The benefit-cost analysis is required for every federal project. The federal government, beginning in the 1980s, has used a mechanism to say, hey, when we make investments, we're going to make the optimal investment in the economic science that is the highest amount of protection or benefit for the lowest cost. Again, you could design higher protection. It may cost more, but it may not get that optimal BCR. So the federal government is just looking out for the federal taxpayers to say, okay, we need to find the optimal amount of protection. But let's be clear here. If we get into the design phase and we decide, you know what, we're going to upsize these pumps because the Army Corps of Engineers has some pumps, right? Because they have to remove any overtopped water or any impounded water. Okay, so they have an idea of what those pump sizes should be, and they have an idea of how that the flow routing should go. But the city of Charleston may say, you know what, you're going to build that pump for us, but we're going to increase the size of it, and we'll pay the marginal cost increase for that. That gives the city more resilience, right? Just in case the modeling runs are a little bit low or sea level rise is a little bit off in 50 years, this gives us some resilience or redundancy for our system. And we're also going to try to make sure that the Army Corps of Engineers pumps that they're going to build for us, if we go forward, it's an if, right? If we go forward, we're trying to make sure that those pumps integrate with the existing drainage system so we get some redundancy there. Okay, and if you think about it, this is a tricky thing because at some point you have to have the right size pumps. At the same time, you have to have the right size pipes so that the pumps can pipe that water. If you have a big pump with a small pipe, it doesn't matter how big the pump is because the pipe is the limiting factor. So there's a lot of technical analysis that goes into this. So,
and what would be the ideal pumps right now for the existing system?
Well, right now they just suggested in their analysis that they need 10 pumps, 5 permanent and 5 temporary. And this is a feasibility analysis. Okay, so when we get into the design phase, we would go and say, you know, you may in fact need 7 permanent and 3 temporary, or you may in fact, whoops, we made a mistake. We may need 12, or we may need 8. Those are things, again, the feasibility analysis, if you think about it, the 3x3 process is 3 years, 3 levels of review, $3 million. That's what this costs. All of the analysis that's been done is feasibility, high level. The real detailed analysis comes in the next phase, in the pre-construction engineering design phase, and that will cost total, it's estimated of $50 million. The city would pay 1/3 of that. So that's what we would do in the next phase of the project to get these really nitty-gritty details worked out.
And what would be the useful life of this particular flood wall or seawall?
So once it is constructed, the Army Corps constructs things for a 50-year design life. This is pretty typical for big infrastructure, 50-year design life. And so from the moment it would be finished and turned over to the city to operate, it would have a useful life of 50 years, providing that the city operated and maintained it. You know, you have to grease the bearings, you have to paint the cement, you have to make sure that paint the steel, make sure the cement is taken care of. You have to practice with it, make sure it's operating. So that's the operations and maintenance. And in the early years, the O&M is not expensive at all because it's brand new. So when you buy a car, you have not much maintenance, and you have a car that's 8 or 10 years old, you need to replace the battery and some other things. So it's the same thing with this kind of a structure. So it has a 50-year design life. In theory, or in the project design here, we would construct this thing and have it ready by 2032. Okay, exact? No. It could be 2030, it could be 2034. We have to go through that design process and then the construction process. But if it was constructed in 2032, it would have a design life until 2082. Does that mean in 2082 it falls down? No, it is still there. You just may have to recertify its ability. You may have to improve it because now the seas are different, the winds are different, the water levels are different. But that structure will still be there, so it will have a residual benefit past its 50-year design life. And let me be clear here. We have suggested to the Army Corps, and they have done this, in the feasibility phase, but in the design phase also, we will construct the foundation of this surge wall, this surge structure, so that it can support the addition of up to 3 feet on top of the 12-foot high in case sea level rise accelerates more than we anticipate. So that's just build some resilience in. We're not going to put that 3 feet on top right away, but if we would need to, we could without having to rip out the bottom of the foundation to make that a costing improvement. So there's some resilience built into this.
Now, any first finished floor elevations that look ideal for the city right now?
First floor refers to sort of FEMA flood risk.
Yes, sir.
So that isn't really related to the surge structure. Those are two separate things. So we have first floor elevations, and that determines your flood risk and your flood hazard, and whether you need flood insurance. But the surge wall doesn't really relate to that.
Okay. And how is the city now addressing flood damage reduction outside of the peninsula?
So we're doing a lot on the peninsula. So it's not one of the worries here, one of the concerns here is, hey, we're spending all the money on the peninsula and on the surge wall. What about everything else? This is not an either-or situation. This, I worked for the Dutch for years. The Dutch have a saying it's an and situation, or as the mayor said, it's and both. So we have to do surge risk, and that's what this structure is about for the peninsula, because it is the highest risk to the peninsula. There's the highest risk to the city, because if you have a surge event, substantial surge event that would hit the peninsula, you would harm the peninsula. You harm the historic district, and what do tourists come here to look at? Where does that revenue? They bring their money here, they spend it in the restaurants. That benefits the city, it benefits the county, it benefits the state. So we have to look at, can we mitigate that flood risk for economic reasons? We have, more importantly, the medical district. That is providing medical provisioning, medical services to people all around the Low Countries. Veterans, there's a research facilities, there are children's hospitals. This is essential infrastructure. The medical district is in the lowest part of the peninsula. It has very high surge risk, and so if a surge event would hit that, how long would those facilities be down? Can we afford that? I mean, you're talking years likely. Charity Hospital in New Orleans never reopened. It was the essential community hospital in the city of New Orleans, and it never reopened after Katrina because the damage was so substantial. So I'm not saying that will happen here, but it does take a year or two to recover from a massive surge event. The College of Charleston, we have the port facilities, we have the business district. There's a lot that would be damaged. There's a lot of folks on the peninsula that don't have flood insurance. How will they recover? And so this is what the surge structure is designed to mitigate. That said, we have stormwater risk. It rains a lot sometimes, and the streets fill up with water, the pipes aren't big enough. How do we manage that? So what are the investments needed there? We still have to do that. We have the tidal flood risk, right? The tides are coming up, king tides, and the water's flowing up through the drainage system, getting into the streets. So we're putting check valves in around the peninsula. We're cleaning the brick arches, as the mayor said. So we're doing a lot of those other things. But the peninsula isn't the only part of the city. So there are drainage projects out in West Ashley, on James Island, on John's Island, up in Cahoy. So we have to do those too. It's not an either-or situation. We have to do it all. Is it costly? Yes. What's the alternative? If we don't do this, if we don't make this investment, what will happen is you will get unmanaged retreat. Unmanaged retreat is deadly for an economy. Right? People will just start to move away. That is just not what we want to do. Charleston is worth saving. Charleston is a special place. It's like Jacksonville or Savannah or Norfolk, these places, Annapolis, Maryland. The Naval Academy is going underwater too. We need to make these investments. It's something we have to do if we're going to stay in these areas. At the same time, we have to think longer term for our planning horizon. And we did this in the comprehensive plan the city adopted last October. The land and water analysis, I encourage everyone to look at that. How is this landscape going to look in the next 50 years? Where's the water going to go? Rainfall, but also tides. How does that water get out of the neighborhoods? These are things we have to look at, because right now the water level is here, right, and sort of main sea level is here, and so the drainage system is coming out of the tide and it's discharging all that water. When the water level gets 2 feet higher, that system is not compromised. So where does that stormwater go? How do we manage that? And that's a land use discussion. That's a planning discussion. That's not just so much of a drainage discussion. It's how do we occupy the space going forward? And these are things we have to continue to work on.
Now, what solutions have you found to the multidimensional challenge of water management in the city of Charleston?
So, look, we have the comprehensive plan. That is setting forth a discussion about how we do our zoning in the future. So, again, what should the baseline elevation be in vulnerable areas? Should we even be developing in the lowest lying areas where no one's living there right now? There are parcels of land right next to the water that aren't developed yet. should we be developing, or should we find a way to allow the owners of that land to monetize the value of that land in a different way? Because if we don't develop there, that allows the sea level to rise without impacting anyone. You're not going to flood anyone because you're not building there. And it allows the marsh to migrate inland. And the marsh provides a tremendous amount of flood risk mitigation benefit. When it's there and it's healthy, marshes are really, really good for sea level rise adaptation. And they're good for the fish and the critters and the recreation too. So that's good. I mean, I think we have to look at things like that. I would encourage everyone to look at the design for the Church Creek Shadow Moss Basin. We have a different project out there. It is setting a template. Here is an area where 32 homes, townhomes were bought out in 2018, 2018. These houses were repeatedly flooded. Federal buyout, city buyout. What do you do with that land? It's in the middle of a neighborhood, a wonderful neighborhood, Shadow Moss. What we're doing there is with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and city money, we are taking that area, it's a 6-acre parcel. It is being designed as a stormwater management park. So it's a park, not a true park, but a management park. So when it's dry, which will be 360 days a year or 350 days a year, people can walk in it, and there'll be some facilities there at the park that benefit the community and helps nature too, the birds and all those things. And nature's returning there. But when when it rains too hard and the water starts filling up the drainage system there, the water will tip over at a certain level and fill up this stormwater park, and it will store that water until the tide goes down and the drainage system can function. So this adaptation becomes a template for how we redevelop the suburban areas of the city going forward. A lot of other communities around the U.S. are doing it, and we're right with them.
And how does the city promote ecological integrity of our natural defenses against floodwaters?
So natural systems provide a tremendous amount of benefit, and if they're not compromised, they can also help you mitigate flood risk, right? So that's very clear. But I want to talk about this in two ways. In a suburban area and an undeveloped area, let's understand what the ecological, the environmental, the natural system is doing for flood risk mitigation and environmental benefit, and not distort it if we can. And if we're going to develop it, let's develop it in a sensitive way that allows those functions to continue as optimally as possible. Again, if you're building in a low area or building in this environmental sensitivity, if you get your house or your structure off of the ground, then the water can continue to flow under there, and things can continue to happen under that system can remain healthy. But if you put concrete in it, you've just compromised the infiltration capacity of that system and the storage capacity of that system. So we need to look at things like that. So in the suburban areas and the natural areas, we need to respect what's there and try to protect it. In developed areas like the peninsula, there isn't a whole lot of ecological in the middle of the peninsula. It's been developed. It's our historic district, our business district. But if we redevelop the low line, we already have ideas about, okay, let's create some more stormwater storage there, so that's high ground. The low line, the old railroad line, it's on high ground. The railroad engineer built on high ground because he didn't want it to fly. So it's high ground. Let's build some facilities there that can help us store some stormwater. And then the stormwater doesn't run off downstream and flood someone else's homes, right? So these are the things we have to think about. For natural defenses for storm surge, because that's sort of what people worry about, let me be clear. Unless you have, so natural defenses for storm surge is a beach. You can strengthen your beach, but we don't have one on the peninsula. Okay. Another natural feature, wonderful feature of salt marsh. But to knock down surge height by 1 foot, you need about a mile of salt marsh for that surge to go over before you knock down that surge height. And as it's going across that salt marsh, that's friction, it also takes away some of the energy of the wave, of the surge. So when it hits whatever it is, it's less. So if you look at the wonderful marshes, off of James Island, behind Folly Beach, they're providing a tremendous amount of environmental benefit, but also flood risk mitigation benefit. But we don't have 5 miles of salt marsh to put around the peninsula. If you have mangroves, which are dense trees, right, you need about a half a mile mangrove to knock down 1 foot of surge height. So if we're talking about reducing surge height and surge forcing by 5 or 6 feet, you just understand right there the math doesn't work, because we have rivers that people have to go up and down. The port is essential. They don't want salt marsh in their navigation channel, so we can't use that. But we can we use natural features ancillary outside of the wall to get some additional benefit? Yes, we can, and those are things we will pursue in the next phase of the project. But we don't have enough salt marsh or mangrove around the peninsula to say, okay, we have this, we don't need the wall. We don't need a surge structure. That is, it just, we don't have enough.
Yeah, and I have two more questions, so you got to run at 12:20. But let me ask you, how would the city move historic structures back before the seawall is actually built?
So the seawall is not going to, you don't have to move these structures back because the seawall is going to protect them. So there's no need. There may be a need in some places, again, you need analysis for that, to elevate those homes because of stormwater. That's a different scenario because the surge structure is primarily meant to deal with storm surge coming in from a hurricane or tropical storm. The stormwater system, the drainage system is meant to deal with the rainfall. And there are places where we just may start to see more rainfall accumulation, ponding. Okay, do you need to elevate? And if you do that, you have to do that in a sensitive way. And again, there are experts who can look at any particular house, and you see it happening in many parts of the city where people are starting to elevate a little bit. So these are things that we do, but the surge wall wouldn't impact that because it's not going to require, the surge wall does not touch upon any historic structure. It's all in public space.
And how would you all let the marsh grow back as it originally was there to help mitigate surge?
So for marsh to grow back, so marsh is very resilient. If it has space, if it has sediment, and if it has nutrients. Okay? So if you don't have space, if there's already a hard edge, whether that's the land edge, on Wagner Terrace, right? That's just a berm, right? Or you have a hard edge, like we're talking about the surge wall. If the marsh hits a hard edge and it doesn't have sediment, it's going to die. And that's what you see, the degradation of the marshes on the west side, the lower parts of the Ashley River on the west side, and even some on the Cooper River side. The water levels have increased. We see with just mean water level increase of 13 inches in the last 8 years. Without additional sediment, the marsh will just start to die. It gets weaker and it dies. You have to have nutrients too. So with the surge wall, they have suggested about 9,000 linear feet of oyster reef on the outside. So what does Oyster Reef do? That's a bit of friction. The oysters go there, they provide some benefit, clean the water, they do some things, but they also provide space for the marsh to grow behind them and in front of them because they trap sediment. And the sediment trapping is this wonderful thing that oysters do for us, and it will allow the marsh to maintain itself. But let's be clear, the marsh outside of the wall will not look like the marsh across the Ashley River, which is so robust, right on the western side on the eastern side of West Ashley. That's wonderful, rich marsh, and we need to protect that. And again, we know there are research projects underway over there for what's called thin fill dredge. And so what they're doing is sediment. What does that mean? The Corps of Engineers is always dredging. The Corps are dredging the harbor channel to keep it open for navigation. Well, you can take the dredge material, the spoil as they call it, and throw it offshore. But if it's sufficient quality and sufficient size, because the sediment has to be a certain quality and certain size, can we put that in the marshes? Well, if you put a foot of sediment, the soil on top of a healthy marsh, you're likely to kill it. Right? Because it doesn't work. But if you put it in thin layers in there, and you keep nourishing the marsh with thin layer additions of sediment fill, then that marsh is going to redistribute that and it's going to maintain itself. So there are research projects underway over there. We're trying to look at that. But that's being done up and down the coast. And the Army Corps of Engineers has a special program called BUDNAP, Beneficial Use of Dredge Material, the Army Corps and their acronyms. That's what they do. It's called the BUDNAP program. And they're trying to do it more and more for environmental restoration.
And the last question for you, Mr. Bill, would the height have to be raised a few feet with that seawall?
I don't understand your question.
Yeah, with the height, would you all have to raise a few feet with the seawall?
Well, it depends on what's happening with sea level rise and then with storms coming in the future. So it is designed to be optimal at 12 foot. It doesn't mean that 13 feet will never come. The 13-foot storm surge will never come. what it means is if a 13-foot surge comes, 1 foot of water will get over the top of it, and that's what these pumps are for, to move that away. And also, if you put a structure around there, you have gravity drainage coming at it, stormwater, rainfall, and it creates the backup that's called impounded stormwater, and they have to manage that water too with those pumps. So these are things. So there are some people who are using sea level rise curves in year 2080 or year 2100 that says, you know what, it may have to be 15 feet for you to stay here. Okay, so that's what I said before. If we get that far, we have the ability to raise the top of the wall by 3 feet without ripping out the foundation. So that's a resilience component. We just don't know how quickly the seas are going to rise. We don't know exactly. So we have this resilience built in. And 12 feet will prevent a whole bunch of damage to the peninsula. Again, when we get to 2080 and we determine we need some more elevation on the top of the wall, we have to see how we do that.
And I want to continue this conversation, but you got to go right off to lunch and into another meeting. But Dale Morris, thank you for your time again. Welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, sir. Likewise.
Great. Thanks.
Yes.